Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
It is a great thrill to have my colleague and friend, Craig Callender of the Department of Philosophy at UC San Diego and the director of the Institute for Practical Ethics. Is that correct? Is that the correct title for it?
That's correct.
Wow. Well, you're joining us on the Into the Impossible podcast at the end of February. We are both vaccinated, at least partially vaccinated, and COVID-free. In case our boss, Pradeep Koshla, or Gavin Newsom might be watching, who knows? He sometimes tunes in, I know for sure. But it's a great thrill to have you here. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, we've interacted for at least the last 10 years on various thesis committees and other affairs. And today we're going to be talking about a book that I've been reading for several years because it's so much fun to read and reread. And that's Time, a graphic novel. I believe that's the title of that book. And then you have another book that we'll talk about as well. So the first question I have for you is, what made you think, was it tenure that allowed you the freedom to write a graphic novel? Are graphic novels considered serious academic fare?
Oh, that's a good question, and one the answer you'll relate to. Yeah, so I was living in London, and we had just bought a house, my first house, and we had just had our first child. And I thought, well, I can't really get any work done with a brand new baby in the house. But the baby would go to sleep like from 2 to 4 in the afternoon every day. And I thought, well, I'll write this cartoon book because I can't really do any kind of real research. And also, I thought, I work so much on time. If I need to go to a library or look up stuff, then it's already getting too hard for a cartoon book. And so I was able to just sort of punch the thing out during nap times for the first month or two of my first one's existence.
Wow. And now he's all grown up, right? He's
Yes.
about to start college, or
That's
is
right.
in college?
Yeah, he just graduated.
Wow. Oh, he just graduated.
Yeah.
Wow. That is true what they say. Time does fly.
It does.
And although I say, and you're the perfect person to ask this of, I think that time is super relative in that various increments of time fly, but other aspects of time drag on. And if you remember back to the days when he was in diapers or whatever, sometimes you would like, as the other cartoon novel called Go the F to Sleep mentions, that sometimes you just want him to go to bed, and that period between dinner time, bath time, story time, bedtime, falling asleep, getting up, wanting water, that drags on. And yet then you turn around and you're like, he's a graduate student? Like,
right.
How is it the psychological arrow of time? How is that relative? It would seem that you could have at most one thermodynamic arrow. We'll talk about one cosmic arrow of time. It's not like there's multiple ones of those, or are there?
Yeah, there are many arrows. And regarding the psychological experience of time, when we talk about time flowing fast or slow or that, I mean, there's so many variables going on. And then one of the big ones, of course, is whether it's something that has been encoded in memory and it's a kind of retrospective judgment, or is it one, sort of about ongoing moments. And, so this is something that's very familiar to many of us who are fortunate enough to just, have the pandemic be such that we are stuck at home and in the same routine, where we think, how could it be Friday again already? It just went by like that. And of course, then we're doing a kind of retrospective judgment over the week. Basically, nothing happened, compared to the previous week. And so if you think of each tick of the sort of psychological clock as being a kind of measuring salient events, there weren't that many, and so there weren't that many top ticks. So it feels like it's going really fast. On the other hand, in the moment, it might be going really slowly. It might seem to drag on, and so it depends on what's going on. Of course, for other people in the pandemic, if you're a nurse at a hospital or something, it might be a very, very different experience. And so this, I would always say, when it comes to the psychological, how long the psychological feeling of duration, as far as I can see, it varies with every single variable that's ever been measured. Yeah. Have you just had orange juice? Have you had coffee, alcohol, mind-altering drugs? It changes all of those things to change your sense of duration.
And of course, there's no one better to talk about the peregrinations in time than Einstein, who is a character in the book, in the graphic novel, as well as Galileo. And then furthermore, we're going to talk about Kurt Gödel as
All right.
well, because little known, we know about his incompleteness theorem. And we know, in my mind, at least, people in physics, you often hear about like someone so has physics envy, or a field has physics envy, recapitulating Freud's penis envy, or what have you. Uh, and But people say, oh, it's so and so field has physics envy. But I think physics has math envy, and maybe math has philosophy envy. So I want to start off in that provocative vein. The fact that we can't really prove something in physics. I mean, you're free to please disabuse me if I'm wrong, but I feel like we don't prove things correct in physics. We can prove things wrong in physics. We can falsify things, as Popper provided this demarcation hypothesis. But on the other hand, we can't prove things as well as a mathematician can prove something. And I think now is sort of needed more than ever, the clarification of what science is and what pseudoscience is and what it is not. And I wonder if you can sort of talk from a philosopher's point of view, but also I see you as a very physics adjacent philosopher, very deep training. Maybe before we move into that, I'm sorry to be so jumping around in time and space, but you inspire me. First, tell us, what is your background exactly? How long have you been here? Where were you before here? What's your world line, as you talk about in the book? What's your past light cone look like?
Okay. Yeah, it's a very unlikely world line, I think. Uh, yeah, so I was, so neither of my parents, went to college. And so I'm not sort of coming up in where academia was sort of a thing I would think of doing. And I was supposed to be a printer.
Hmm.
So my great grandfather, grandfather, and father were all printers. And so, just do a little bit of induction on that, and all the mail calendars were printers. And so it seemed clear what I was going to do. But then this thing got invented and became popular called the computer.
Hmm.
And the, the print industry did not seem to be such a great industry to go into anymore. This kind of skilled labor that was special to printing was then not going to be valued as much, because you could do something almost as good for so much cheaper with a computer. And so then, given that background, it seemed like I should be either a doctor or a lawyer. And so I started off in biology and chemistry. But boy, once I hit college, there was so many interesting things, and I just bounced around from one major to another. So I almost became a math major. But I almost became an art major. I did become a psychology major for a brief moment.
Where were you a student?
Providence College.
Oh,
So they
Providence,
gave
okay.
me so they gave me a scholarship, which was
Nice.
nice.
Yeah.
And
You
yeah,
grew
and
up in
then
Rhode Island also?
sorry, I'm from Rhode Island.
Oh, which
yeah.
part?
Providence.
So I was in Brown. Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah, yeah.
we probably overlapped at one point or another,
That's
maybe
right.
on a home visit or something like that.
Yeah, Brown's wonderful.
Yeah. So it was
Um,
Providence. Providence is a gem of a school. And so you went from there.
So yeah, so then
Mhm.
but I always had, so I would get, my uncle would give me, uncle and aunt, they would give me gift certificates to the Brown University bookstore,
Mhm.
and I was always
It was a
reading.
great bookstore.
And my mother is still, but especially back then, obsessed with science fiction,
Hmm.
and so I would read a lot of that too, because there's a lot of that in the house. And so this always kind of put me in this more kind of philosophy of physics trajectory. And then I went to Rutgers University, which was one of the it was one of the best places to go. It still is in philosophy,
Mhm.
and they happen to have all these great philosophers of physics there. And so I just and then I went. So yeah, so what really triggered things then to go into philosophy of physics was I went to a popular talk by David Merman,
Mm.
where he was explaining Bell's theorem and doing one of those kind of simple coloring theorems, so anybody could understand it.
Right.
And I walked out of that lecture and I just couldn't believe it. And I thought, well, if you're interested in philosophy and metaphysics in the world, here's this experiment that is like really experimental metaphysics. It's so interesting. And I basically dropped everything and then started just reading quantum mechanics and
Mm.
reading it, and then happened to be in a place where I could, where it was just fantastic. I mean, all these great people, not just at Rutgers, but Princeton and
Right.
in New York, who work in this area. And so it was really just really super lucky that I was able to be there and do that.
And then after that, did you have to? What's typical in philosophy? Is it postdoc or what was your thesis? By the way, what was the title of your thesis or subject?
Explaining time's arrow.
Okay, all right.
So it was about
our alley.
a lot of it was about quantum mechanics and time's arrow. And yeah, in philosophy, well, it's changing a little bit the discipline now, where there are more postdocs and things like that. But back then, it was crueler or kinder, depending on how you look at it. You're either gonna, if you work, especially if you worked in a kind of niche field like philosophy of physics, you were probably either going to go to some really, a research school, because a small liberal arts college doesn't need a philosopher of physics, or you're going to work at McDonald's. One of the, and so
it's your choice.
One or the other. And since there weren't any postdocs, you found out fast.
Right.
And so I was lucky. So you mentioned Popper, and so Popper died, I think, in '94. And in '96, I took a job at the London School of Economics, and they had that Center for Philosophy of Science that Popper founded, I guess. And and then at some point I got sick of the rain and came here. So I've been here for over 20 years.
Oh, wow. So you're a longer timer than myself. I got here in 2004, and I became aware of you not too long after that, actually, coming and being in some committees, and I met our colleague David Meyer and others through you. And of course, you have a gift for not only researching and mentorship in this field, but also in terms of leadership and authorship, which I think is an important part of what we do as scientists and as public servants, in a sense, and kind of demystifying science and distinguishing it from science and pseudoscience. And I was excited to learn of your upcoming course, which I may sit in on. I've done that before with some of our fellow faculty. As I mentioned, you're my first UCSD. You're not my first UCSD fellow professor. You're my first non-relative UCSD professor. So there's been some nepotism. I'm hoping to have our chancellor and other people come on the show. But it's always a treat to do things in person. And I was saying beforehand, or earlier in this conversation, we kind of have this envy of mathematicians, at least some of us in physics, because at least they're the bounds of what can be proven, and actually things can be proven. You can prove Fermat's last theorem, right? You can prove the Pythagorean theorem, but you can't prove that Einstein is right to arbitrary accuracy. So I think that we use Popper as kind of a substitute for Gödel. And I wonder if you could kind of, distinguish for me or tell me if I'm wrong in that sense. As scientists, we kind of rely so much on Popper's falsification, demarcation, and maybe you can explain what that is, that we lose sight of the fact that even Popper didn't fully support demarcation and falsification as the sine qua non of what science is. So how did he get to be so elevated? How did Popper get to this exalted level where people will say things like string theory and other things are not only not correct, they're bad for science, they're bad science, they might as well be pseudoscience?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny because Popper is, what you go to for demarcation. So you want to separate the good science from the bad, good theory from bad theory. Popper was, of course, a creature of his time. You had in philosophy all this kind of, Hegel and all this stuff, which is very hard to make sense of. You don't even know if it's making sense sometimes. But then also he saw, not Marxism so much the economic side, but the sort of Marxist theory, dialectical materialism. Thank you, and Freud. He thought all of this is nonsense, and then came up with this demarcation criterion of falsifiability. And of course, for him, Einstein's the Eddington experiment in 1919 for vindicating, confirming Einstein's the bending of light around the sun. This was amazing, because that was a bold, risky hypothesis, right? It was not a given that was going to turn out that way. And he thought, you look at that, and then you look at Freud, and you notice the difference,
right?
Astrology. But anyway, so Popper's super famous for this. No philosopher of science likes the demarcation criterion from Popper. We all can't stand it. And it's kind of funny that it gets used so much in the outside world.
Yeah.
But then in philosophy of science, we don't use it at all. It's very problematic, because you can think of, well, first there's the Hubble part and falsifiable. What makes it not just not false, but unfalsifiable. In some sense, you could make any theory falsifiable or unfalsifiable if you tinker with them. Also, you can think of a lot of things. Yeah, so like string theory as it's coming up. Well, it's not. You can't directly subject it to empirical confirmation. But on the other hand, the goal always was to do that. And so, is it unfalsifiable or not? Also, you can think of things. Astrology is just false,
right?
But it's not. But
right,
yeah.
Therefore, it's science, right?
Yeah, so therefore, it's science.
I have a big problem with that as well.
And so it's not very good.
Or the Earth is flat. Okay, that's my theory. Okay,
Yeah.
I can falsify it with simple measurements. Therefore, it's scientific. I mean, it's nonsense.
Yeah. So it's not a very good criterion, and so now I think there's sort of I don't really know exactly, but I think most philosophers of science think that there's like kind of set of things that you look for in a theory, and they might be how unified they are, how fruitful they are, how predictive they are, and you'll allow for tolerances and all those things. And there's some sort of rough metric we use when we do this.
Right.
I think there's a kind of more like picture I think you get more from history and not so much philosophy, where they really think of it as more like just at a time is our stamp of disapproval on that.
Right.
And that changes with time through history.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's sort of fashion so we use it as just a kind of insult, blah.
Right. Right. Popper said, which is an appeal to authority, which we don't hold.
Yeah. So Popper didn't like. So so they would then interpret Popper's thing as basically that Popper didn't like Freud.
Right.
And but if you had this kind of multi-criterialist thing, you'd say, well, Freud's theory wasn't successful in predicting anything. It didn't, it failed in all sorts of different ways. Too flexible.
Right.
Yeah. So there's like these kind of signs of when you think of really cheesy pseudoscience, then you see this kind of overly flexible.
Can accommodate anything. What I always like to point out is, Popper hated astrology, or this is the thing, he hated Freud, as you just said, or he was against Freud, he was against astrology, he was against dialectic materialism and Marxism. And then if you go to like most countries, there are far more Marxist socialist countries on earth than there are capitalist democracies on earth. There are far more, psychologists in the world practicing dream interpretation, all the things he hated. And you can find much more ink in your, Sunday newspaper about astrology than astronomy. And so it's like even Popper has been falsified by the,
exactly.
the durability of the
I love it. That's
subject.
a good point.
Yeah. So, but again, I mean, we're kind of, peering out of this dark cave and looking after we see these shadows and trying to make sense of the world. Do you think that there's a value? I mean, we often hear pejoratives, about philosophy, about, philosophy of science, people, varying degrees of the old canard that, science needs philosophers the way that, birds need ornithologists or something like that. But, I find philosophy to be so rich and so, and just so enjoyable. And I feel that to not teach it, or, even worse, to be pejorative, insulting towards it, I think we do our physics students a disservice. What do you think about this? And how can we make it more besides buying all your books and using them in our classes? But in reality, how can we dispel this rumor that philosophy is not useful?
Yeah, imagine if birds were equipped with knowledge of ornithology.
Yeah,
I mean, they would really have it made on Earth. If they knew their own behavior patterns and all of that, they would really just kill it. Even I think I think philosophy is really important, and in particular when it comes to physics, because I think what has happened, and it's weird and unfortunate. I think, and I'm not a sociologist, so I don't know if this picture is exactly right. But if you look at you look at some of the greats in physics, from so Boltzmann, Maxwell, Einstein, all these people, they read a lot of philosophy. So Einstein talks about David Hume inspired him.
Galileo and Descartes, right? They lived contemporaneously.
And so you've had this was hugely important, and then you go, but it was part of a lot of philosophy is part of the German training,
Mhm.
and a lot of the theoretical physicists were German.
Right.
Now, you go to now fast forward to after the war.
Mhm.
Now America is in ascendancy in the sciences. You have the government putting a ton of money into the sciences. Who's not popular? The Germans.
Mhm.
And then you have people who are like some of the greatest philosophers I think have ever existed going around saying they don't like philosophy, like Feynman.
Yeah.
So Feynman is philosophically gifted, but he would again and again say he doesn't like philosophy,
Right.
as he's basically doing it.
Right.
And then you have, like Hawking in his last book. He starts off with, philosophy is dead.
Right.
And then the whole book is basically some philosophy of science.
Right.
Where
With
he's got
his
this kind of multi-picture, giving up on a grand unified theory and this kind of multi-picture thing. It's all philosophy of science.
yeah.
But he doesn't know it's philosophy of science, and he says he hates philosophy.
Yeah.
at
He
the beginning.
disparages the thing that he's actually engaging in.
And so you have this kind of, shut up and calculate attitude happen, coinciding with this sort of sociological pressures, and then also, but the rise of grants and all of that as
Mhm.
well, where it's hard to get a grant for.
Mhm.
Would Einstein have got a grant for his either of his relativity, the special or general relativity?
Right.
Probably not.
Right. He would have
uh,
gotten it for his quantum mechanical misgivings, I'm sure, because those turned out not to be fruitful.
Yeah,
In
and
some
so I
ways.
see the other side. So I see the people who are leaving physics. I mean, almost by definition, I end up seeing the people who are leaving physics because they start off in physics and then they are not satisfied that they don't get to talk about what quantum mechanics means and different interpretations and
Mhm.
detail in quantum mechanics and that. So I mean, I don't get refugees from cosmology or
Right. Yeah.
astrophysics,
Not
though.
too much because it is so philosophical,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, in
Yeah,
some sense, it's
they can
meta.
scratch that itch.
Yeah,
whereas-
because as Hoyle used to say, all these cosmologists, are in love with the Big Bang because it satisfies their philosophical needs or their theological needs to believe in Genesis account of creation, which is just, so. But I did find a more ancient kind of upgrading of philosophy in Galileo's Siderius Nuncius, where he talks about the telescope which he was using at the time to, in his claim, resolve all the stars in the Milky Way, the glow of the Milky Way's milkiness into individual stars. And he says, thus we have proven via visible certainty these issues that have for so many generations vexed philosophers. In other words, he's saying, like, you guys could speculate, but one use of the telescope will prove to you that it's right. And I point out in my book, Losing the Nobel Prize, he was actually wrong about that. It was confirmation bias, and we can't resolve all the milkiness of the Milky Way into stars, with no matter how big your telescope is, despite what Galileo said, because it's not made of stars. It's glowing dust. The villain of my book, as I gave you a little grain of earlier today. And so, I think it has some historical precedent, but the fact that I always feel like by not observing it or not, learning from philosophers and philosophers of all kinds, that we're kind of doing a disservice to our scientists. But we have so much to teach them. It's like, do we require that they have a course in this? One thing I'm curious about is ethics, because I've never taken a course or something in ethics, and you are the director of the Center for Practical Ethics. First of all, what is a scientist, scientifically inclined, person who wrote a very physics-y kind of thesis and has written books, great detail in physics as you have. Where does ethics come into play, and what makes you, and how many hats can you possibly wear?
Yeah, it's well, that's a question I ask myself all the time. Yeah, so I would say, so sometimes I joke that it's, it was a sort of midlife crisis, but that's not really true because so I've taught environmental ethics for 20 years or more.
Mhm.
And so I've always had this kind of teaching interest. And I guess I just thought of it as kind of, you know, returning some of what I've been given, where, if all you're worried about is empty space times, like if I'm just interested in vacuum space times with no people or problems or planets or particles or anything in them, then, it's nice to, at the undergraduate level, to be doing something more than only that. And then the opportunity really rose, came to me to where I was department chair, and I saw, here we are, UC San Diego. I forget where we are, we're the sixth biggest recipient of research aid in the country.
Yeah.
So we're one of the people don't appreciate this, but people on your podcast, hearing your podcast, should know. I mean, UCSD is rivals any school
Yeah.
in terms of its research output, but we don't have really that much ethics, and it was very much a STEM. It's very much a STEM school,
Mhm.
and if you think about the kind of innovation and that happens here, a lot of it holds great promise and is just amazing. On the other hand, some of it comes with some perils as well, and so we're sort of, by not dealing with some of it in house, we're sort of externalizing and outsourcing our social responsibility.
Right.
And so I went around campus giving these kind of talks, talking about, so we were founded by, I got to have dinner with him once when I first came, with Herb York.
Mhm.
And, he worked in the Manhattan Project,
Right.
but then he's worked on nuclear deterrence the rest of his
Right.
life.
There's a book about that.
Paul Revelle discovers climate change. Then he comes back from Harvard and becomes a professor of social policy, trying to think of ways to deal with it. And so we have this great, in our DNA, this great history of these great scientists finding these amazing, making these amazing discoveries and innovation,
Mhm.
but then also trying to deal with the social repercussions. And so I thought this was a good message, and it sort of sold, and we got this institute, and we've been trying to develop that institute. And then as I've been doing that, so maybe the same has happened with you with the Science Fiction Center and this podcast. If you spend a certain amount of time on something, then you get drawn into it more. And so now I've started working a little bit more in practice. So now my research and teaching sides have blurred a bit, and so now I'm starting to work a little bit more in practical ethics.
And in terms of the meaning of that phrase, practical ethics, is it that application to the research side of what UCSD does, or is it categorical imperatives and kind of bigger picture things?
Yeah, we're trying to make it more practical in the sense of connecting to science that's done on campus. Well, it doesn't have to be done on campus,
Sure.
but often is. So, for instance, we have we've had a great partnership with the biologists working on gene drives.
Mm.
So, gene drives are a way of genetically modifying an organism, not like old-fashioned stuff where you just modify the individual. It either passes the trait on or it doesn't. This one, you can force it to pass it on. So it unleashes this kind of genetic irreversible chain reaction.
Mm.
So it can be used for amazing things, so they're working on making it so that mosquitoes can't transmit malaria.
Mm.
And then all the children won't be able to do that. And they would just keep going and keep going. Mm-hmm. So it'd be amazingly efficient.
Right.
In principle, it would never work this way, but in principle, you could drop one mosquito, in an affected area in Africa, and all the mosquitoes eventually would be sterilized or unable to transmit it anyway. Mm-hmm. Of course, that's the ideal thing. That won't really work, but of course, this will change have ecological repercussions. Mm-hmm. What is the long-term consequences of having this kind of genetic technology out there in nature? So we have partnerships with them, and where we'll look at sort of all the different ethical aspects of that. Mm-hmm. It could be all sorts of things, autonomous cars, brain organoids, all sorts of things.
Yeah, the kind of stuff we're working on in the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. And so getting back to, some of these figures that I have finger puppets of, we're working on yours, a Callender finger puppet as well. But one of the characters is Kurt Gödel, who spends an awful lot of time in the book, at least, talking about his universe. And I want to, because it is relatively unfamiliar to many of the listeners out there who know the kind of, Friedman, Robertson, Walker, kind of description, Lemaitre, Big Bang, but this type of universe, which is very special, that Gödel thought about, is very much not in vogue, maybe for good reason. But I want to explore some of the different space times that you do talk about. Sterile though they may be, like these mosquitoes, hopefully will eventually be sterile. I've always wondered, what is the purpose of the mosquito? if you could figure out what is there mosquito. Turns out there's a book written about it. It's called like Apex Predator or something, because it's people ask what animal in Africa has killed the most human beings, and it's like the hippo, the tiger. No, it's the mosquito. And the guy goes through like some of the ways that the mosquito changed history, including in the Revolutionary War, when apparently the swamps and eastern seaboard or whatever of America were riven with mosquitoes, and the British had less immunity to malaria or something, or they didn't have quite. I don't know the details, but apparently the mosquito played a role in the victory by the colonists against the British Empire. So
I know this book. I haven't read it yet.
Yeah,
but,
it's a very fascinating, because everything that there could be these downstream effects. You talk a lot in your book, in the graphic novel, about time travel. Can you go back and kill the dinosaurs before the asteroid, or give them a space program before the asteroid hits, or go back and kill your grandfather before he meets your grandmother. And so all these kind of paradoxes. But I want to focus a little bit more first on the top level, on the cosmological side of things, because a lot of my audience is interested in that. Can you explain a little bit about Gödel's universe, why it was important, why he allegedly on his deathbed asked his attendee or whoever was there, what about the universe? Did they find it to be rotating? This is a story that I've read actually in a book about Gödel.
All right.
So people still do write books about this rotating universe. So
yeah,
what's the appeal of it? What was the idea behind it?
Yeah. So Gödel was at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and he lived near Einstein, and they would walk home together. And so Gödel was not a physicist, but he was the greatest logician of all time. In fact, before the Gödel incompleteness theorem, which is the greatest theorem in logic of all time, he was already the greatest logician of all time.
Right.
And then he did that. So he got extra. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is he's really, really smart. So he's talking to Einstein.
Too smart for his own good, right? Because he tried to talk to Einstein when he was becoming a citizen, and allegedly said there's a contradiction in the United States Constitution, logical inconsistency. And Einstein said, keep that to yourself until after citizenship. But anyway, go on. So he was talking to Einstein about cosmology and space-time.
Yeah, and then he discovered a solution. And, it's very, if you, I don't know how many of your listeners know, I mean, the Einstein field equation is very, it looks so pretty, science is so pretty and beautiful and elegant. And, because you've got basic, G equals 8 pi t. You think, oh, that's beautiful. Really, it's, I don't know, what, like a 100 something partial differential equations. So if you solve it, you get your name after it. Right. And he came up with this solution, which I think it's possibly the coolest solution in terms of because it has very cool consequences of what you can do. So in particular, you could time travel from any point to any other point in Gödel space-time. But what's cool about it is it doesn't happen from any kind of cheesy math tricks. So like you could take, if you took a piece of paper, you said, let this be space-time, this part is time, this part is space, and then I roll it and I attach these two, then you can say, well, I could time travel by going around like that. That's cheesy because you did this kind of cut and paste
wormholes.
But now the Gödel space-time it's topologically Euclidean, so there's nothing holes. It's simply connected. Yeah, so there's no holes or anything like that.
Coffee cup genus number is 0, right?
It's even temporally orientable, which means that at every single event you could draw a little arrow and have a consistent arrow drawing everywhere.
To the future or in space? Like the vector is a vector
time-like. And so, so even on a closed time-like curve, you could still draw arrows consistently around that curve.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
unlike a Mobius strip, which is not orientable. Right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't have any kind of shenanigans like the Mobius strip or that. And yet, there it is. So it's got two things that are really weird. So one is that you could time travel from any point to any other point. And so, the universe looks like all the matter is rotating around you. And it looks that way from every single direction. And what this does is it sort of tips as you go out from any point, it's going to seem like to you and when you're looking at the picture of it,
Mhm.
the light cones are going to seem like they're tipping over,
Mhm.
and and as you go outward, if you accelerate, you'll be able to spiral around and go back and say visit your birth. The other really weird thing, and I think this is what he thought was actually the weirdest thing about it, was that because all the light cones tip over, you can't uh, draw a global instantaneous slice of time.
Hmm.
So if you say, well, I want my slice of time to be entirely space-like, an instant of time should be all space-like, there is no global such slice. Because as you start to extend it out, it becomes time-like
Mhm.
because of the light cones tipping over into it. And so if you tried to stay space-like, you can't do it. And so you can't then think, this really disturbed him, I think more than the time travel, because you can't then think of the universe as sort of unfolding in some kind of
Tense.
yeah.
Mhm.
Whereas like in the other, in the more famous cosmological models, like Friedman, Roberts, and Walker, it's still relativistic, and so you could have different observers, measuring time differently and all that. But you could pick particular. Well, there you usually use these co-moving coordinates and pick a particular frame. But anyway, the point is you could pick a cosmic time and then think of the universe as evolving according to that cosmic time. But you just can't do that. There's no cosmic time in Lagrange space time.
And there's no expansion either, right?
No. And yeah, so it's not our space time.
Sure, no, but it's as you said, to just for the listener that may not be conversant with this, as you said earlier, you solve the Einstein's equation in almost any context, and you get your name on it. And many people have tried to do it, and there's very few that have their names on these models. So to come up with anyone, let alone one that comports with, cosmology, reasonable observations in cosmology, is a triumph, mathematically. I guess the question that I have is did he believe in it? Because it was before the really dispositive evidence of expansion that Hubble and his and actually Hubble's early data were incredibly coarse and not dispositive, right? Until the 30s, 40s, 50s, it got better and better, and even until the 50s and 60s, people had arguments with the Big Bang. It wasn't even the universe was expanding, was not taken seriously, including by the former inhabitant of this office, Jeffrey Burbidge, who, with his colleague Fred Hoyle, they went to their graves believing in the falsity of the Big Bang model and the truth of the quasi-steady state universe. So it wasn't nearly as accepted even when Gödel was alive. So did he believe it, or did he think, oh, it's really cool for a logician to make to get his name on a?
I don't think he believed it. Although I think there were attempts to tinker with it to make it a little more possible, that it might be possible in some way to accommodate the data. But he had this really curious argument. And philosophers have puzzled about this argument for a long time, because he says there's this Gödel universe, his solution. It's a solution to the laws of nature, the Einstein field equations. And then he says that showed that time in our world, which is not the Gödel world, is ideal. And by ideal, I think he means just fiction of art, due to us, not due to the world. And so then now you look at this argument and you think, well, what is the argument exactly here? Because it's very puzzling. And so people would point out, they'd say, you can't go from, there's a possible world to a fact about this world. So there's a possible world where there are unicorns. That doesn't mean there are unicorns here. And to this, so people point this out, and then I think, well, this is crazy because we're talking about the world's greatest logician,
right?
So he didn't make an elementary logic mistake. That's clearly not what's going on. And so I think what he thought is that what he called this lapse of time, and what you referred to as tense, I think he thought that was essential to time, and that there was a a world that obeyed our laws but didn't have that time, then meant that here too it might not be that, that's not a feature of time even here. So the T is still the T,
Right.
and the T in the Gödel universe is still the T in the, whatever universe we're in, some kind of Friedmanian thing. And so if it didn't lapse there, it's not lapsing here. And so it must just be that we sort of attribute the lapse to it.
It's not fundamental.
It's not fundamental.
Interesting.
But we don't really know exactly what the argument was.
It'd be cool to work out, if it were, because the implication is, it's sort of the time is emergent or fictional or maybe not intrinsically fundamental, part of elementary reality. And you see a lot of these things that come out. I had Carlo Rovelli on my podcast, which the episode will be out before this one, most likely. I had Roger Penrose on 3 or 4 times. Here's his book, Cycles of Time, where he has this alternative model, which has the universe never really experiencing the Big Bang or the inflationary epoch that many cosmologists, the dominant, kind of prevailing model right now, although it seems to lack decisive evidence. We may be in this Popperian, no man's land where we can't falsify inflation because it could have happened, but without enough energy to produce waves of gravity that my colleagues and I can detect. On the other hand, it could be that some alternative cosmology took place, but they don't make any falsifiable predictions, such as Roger's model. It would just be, you wouldn't observe gravitational waves because there is no inflationary field to nucleate these, quanta of gravity. I want to ask you a question that I keep asking, and you mention it in the book as well. But I asked Roger, and I asked, people like Lenny Susskind and Frank Wilczek. We kind of use, at least to me, a circular type of logic, which is to say that, we need to understand and have a quantum theory of gravity because we don't understand the physics in extremely strong, quantum physics in extremely strong gravitational scenarios, such as at the near the singularity of a black hole, and such as at the origin of time, or the Big Bang, as we might say. And I point out that both of those regimes are unverifiable, they're inaccessible. We can't get any information out from a singularity. We can get some notion of things on the event horizon of a black hole, but no more. Hawking and Penrose with singularity theorems, basically show that you're never going to be able to get back to absolute zero in time if it indeed exists. And Roger doesn't even believe there's an absolute zero of time. He believes in a cyclic cycle of aeons, as he calls them. So why are we so concerned with this theory of everything involving quantizing gravity if the only two regimes in which we can observe it would be unobservable or where it becomes applicable rather, are unobservable?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I I hope that there would be some regime where it's observable, and I would expect it to be actually in cosmology, because that's sort of the biggest lab.
Me too.
That's the biggest lab where, and so it's running these natural experiments that we can't run.
Right.
And so I would hope that some of these things would, so they seem really, 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 so we're going to measure, so the electrons have mass. There should be a gravitational effect, inside the tiniest, and just hydrogen that making some sort of little, we should be able to make little gravitational corrections for whatever's going on there. And then inside, and then when things clump, when a star clumps up really, really tight, then there's got to be quantum effects that at a certain scale. And so we know that there is some physics that we don't know that must operate in these cases, I think. So I think that's where we're kind of safe. But those two cases, as you just pointed out, those two cases are cases where we're not going to ever observe. Right. But it could be that there's, I don't know there might be something bootstrappy about this, but if we think of different, so there's some work and different interpretations of quantum mechanics. So Roger Penrose has stuff like this, where suppose you put in like a realistic collapse mechanism. So the quantum wave function collapsed and you have a very specific sort of trigger for what does that. That might show itself in, you know, well, who knows? It would be more a question for you. You know, what does it show itself in the fluctuations? Does it show itself extended over time through the universe? So some of those theories will depart from. They'll make predictions that are actually non-standard that you could actually test and maybe rule out or that.
Yeah. So when I think about that, first of all, so I don't answer any questions on my own podcast. I'm just kidding. That's my prerogative as host. I actually was interviewed by Barry Barish for my own podcast 2 weeks ago at his house in Los Angeles, which is kind of a treat. So I was answering his questions about why I'm so bitter and so forth about not winning the Nobel Prize, but that's for another subject. Stay tuned for that special episode. But thinking about that, in just a little bit more depth, this concept of a singularity is intimately connected with both the black hole and potentially with the Big Bang. And of course, even observing these waves of gravity via their imprint on the cosmic microwave backgrounds, B mode polarization, technically wouldn't take us back to t=0. It would be, 1,000 Planck times or something, be significantly after in Planck units, the origin of time or the singularity itself. My question, is kind of maybe it's philosophical, but I almost see a Zeno's paradox-like effect where we have no examples of something in the universe that is a singularity, is infinite. Because in order for something to be infinite, as you remember from your kids, you tell them I love you infinity. They say I love you infinity plus one. Infinity minus one would have to be the temperature of the universe. 1 Planck time after the origin of the universe. Then infinity minus one is infinity. So these questions of singularities are kind of perplexing in that we kind of are led to believe that they exist by extrapolation from our current time. But, predictions about the future, as Yogi Berra said, are very uncertain. It's hard to make them. But even predictions about the past, when they involve singularities, since we have no singularity evidence of any quantity that is infinite, why do we put so much stock in the existence of singularities philosophically speaking?
Yeah. Well, they're very disturbing because you don't know. Well, you don't know what they are. I mean, even in general relativity, when we talk about a singularity, well, the singularity theorems just show that all the world lines are incomplete, right? So they don't actually show there's like a whole. So there's 3 notions of singularity, right? So there's sort of this incomplete notion, so geodesic, what's called geodesic incompleteness.
Yep.
Then there's this sort of idea of a kind of curvature blow up, where then there's your infinity. So now the curvature just blows up, and then you get this idea of like a hole, like a little point has been blocked out, like a kind of open sewer cap in space time where you just been walking and then
not a coordinate singularity, actual singularity, right? Manhole cover, not replaced.
Yeah, and then I don't know, it's kind of interesting. I think that in the kind of geometry that you do classical physics, those notions coincide. And then you go to, so in relativity, you use what's called a pseudo-Brownian geometry, and then those notions come apart. And so we sort of think of the incompleteness as maybe it's like an indicator or a symptom of the other things, but we don't really know. And so what the heck is a singularity at all anyway? Right. And then why is it, everyone says, well, general relativity sows the seeds of its own demise by predicting these singularities. But then you think, well, why? Why is that so bad, actually, if it does have this incompleteness? I mean, who died and said that we get to decide how the universe should be?
Quantum physics traffics in that, right? Normalization, bare mass, dressed mass, those are all corrections to the formal infinities that arose from considering, Coulomb effects at infinitesimal distances.
Maybe I'm just, thinking aloud here, but maybe the reason we don't like it is because all the places we see singularities elsewhere in physics, we don't really believe in them. We think of them as part of the representation of the physics. Right. So like the example I like is, of a water drop coming out of your faucet. And, when you model it physically, the water drop never breaks, just sort of gets like
Right.
infinitely thin.
Tenuous.
And then what you have to do is with your mind bring in some scissors and cut it.
Or just
but we know what real water drops do form.
Right.
And so there's there's a mismatch there between the mathematical representation and the reality. And so we have no problem bringing out our mental scissors and snipping.
Right. Right. And it's something,
Water
computers can't, speaking of water, you should enjoy some. I mean, computers can't handle it. We have, not a number. We have things. It seems like the human mind is the unique entity that we know that can conceive of infinity, and in fact, multiple levels, as you know, of infinity. There's different degrees of infinity. As my kids will point out when I say, you should have said you love me infinity plus one, then they'll say infinity squared, then they'll say Aleph zero. But I got some annoyingly precocious kids. But the kind of this thing that is so baffling, I think, is so resilient to understanding is what makes time so interesting. I mean, there's so many books about time. I just reread A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, and I read it first when I was 16 or 17. You probably were excited by it when it came out, and I didn't understand it. And I remember going to see and hear Stephen Hawking speak in '95 at the Royal Astronomical Society meeting in London. And that was back when he could still respond in quasi real time using, his finger and his eyes. And someone asked him, Professor Hawking, why'd you write this book? Nobody understands it. It's rumored that people have never even completed it, even you, from cover to cover. Why'd you write this book? And he replied in that, that kind of iconic voice of his, if such a thing can be said, because my daughter needed to go to college. And I had Leonard Mlodinow on the podcast about a month ago, and he was talking in all seriousness, about the need for Hawking to have a basic corporate function, that he needed to support his medical care, he needed to support his kids, his ex-wife, his whatever it is, and it was a real need for him. But in that book, the last sentence, I was tweeting about this yesterday, the last sentence in that book is, if we could, finally come up with a origin story for, how time begins, something like that, then we would glimpse the mind of God. And it's kind of brings up, this next question. First of all, why are physicists so, in love with talking about God particles, the mind of God not playing dice? But we won't get into that now. For such an atheistically inclined body of humans. But I want to ask you, in the context of time, we have so many different interpretations. Carlo Rovelli, Roger Penrose. Can they all be right? I mean, can they all be seeing the same aspects of the elephant and just describing it differently, or to what extent is there a theory of time?
I think there could be some winners and some losers here. I mean, whether we could ever know who is who, I don't know. But to me, I divide it into basically two sorts of people. So what's going on. I think what makes time so fascinating and why there are so many books and all of this is because, well, I think there's with up there with consciousness is one of the last great mysteries. Why is it such a mystery? I mean, physics has a time variable in it. Physics is one of our best theories. It's we just put another rover on Mars.
Helicopter landed.
Helicopter. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's one of the and all of that theory required a time variable,
right?
And so that's all indirect confirmation for the way physics considers time.
Newtonian time at that, right?
Yeah. And
relativity to get to Mars.
But I think what makes it so interesting is because, our experience of time is just so divorced from this. And so just like with the problem of consciousness, you could look at, all you want of brain scans and you're not going to see anything. And, you're not, and they're going to dig around in the mind and then find a little you there.
Right. Homunculus.
And so with time, you have this massive, you've got this idea of this flowing now. And, so you divide the world into past, present, and future. And then this present moves. And also you endow the past and the future with different things. You think the past is fixed and settled. The future is open. So where I can't, there's no knob I can toggle that's going to change where I was born. but there's a lot of buttons I can press that would change where I die.
Right.
Uh, and so you have these massive differences. But now you look over at physics and you don't see any of that stuff.
Right.
I don't see the past and future. I don't see a distinguished present, and I don't see differences between the past and future.
Right.
And so you have this gap. And then, I mean, that's where I had this kind of, I was working on all these kind of physicsy topics earlier in my career. And then when I came here, there, we were so good in cognitive science, and there were all these people working on time perception and that. And I got talking to them, and all of a sudden I realized, that there's not a good theory of how, it seems crazy that to me still that you don't have a good theory of how, the interaction between physical time and sort of human time. And so physicists, you'll have all these, will make side comments every now and then. So like in Brian Greene's book, he'll talk about memory and have a kind of proto theory of how this works.
Mm-hmm.
Seems perfectly fine to me, but basically they say, oh, but all that flowing stuff, it's an illusion. And so what they're doing is they're taking the problem, and they're taking it off the desk of the physicist and then putting it on the desk of the psychologist by saying it's an illusion. But then the psychologist doesn't know it's on their desk.
Right, the cog side.
And so then it comes to the philosophers are on the floor, and so we get to
whatever falls off the desk.
And so then I had this idea of trying to explain this and really do it kind of a bit rigorously. And so this is not in my cartoon book, but in the other book. And the kind of picture I have is, I'm wondering, so we've got this critter who's gone around, let's say in a relativistic world. So physics is right about time, but they model time in this kind of tensed flowing way. Why would they do that? And so I tried to show is that it would make sense in such a world, even if the world isn't like that, given the environment, given the thermodynamic arrow, given the kind of challenges that we as organisms face. And so the way I think of it is, so I thought of it a little bit more like on the model of color. So you don't think of, fundamental, hydrogen, what color is it? You don't think of a fundamental world as colored. You know that it has to do with, the type of creature you are and the relationship you have with it. So it's not just physics, because it's not just the surface reflectance profile.
Right.
It's also, how many rods and cones do I have, and what type, what type of creature am I? Mm-hmm. And then that opens up a kind of, once you start thinking about it this way, it opens up a fascinating avenue to explore that is still being explored, which is, why does that creature have that rod and cone structure? Mm-hmm. Well, now look at the colors of the fruits and stuff like this. What type of fruits does it eat? But then of course now the evolutionary story is very complicated, because maybe the fruits developed that way because there were creatures to eat them. But then you can think about the same kind of thing with time now, where you think, well, so I do think of, some events as simultaneous and some not. Mm-hmm. Think of these two snaps. Bob Garrosh, I think in his book, says that in your reference frame that you have to do the snaps within 1/1000th of a second to get them space-like related to each other.
Okay, they're a foot apart.
Yeah, mm-hmm. yeah. And anyway, so they're, so one is after the other most likely, but I'm still judging them as some of them as simultaneous and some not. Mm-hmm. But why? I'm doing this with audio and visual matching, and then I started looking at the different people who do it differently. So there's a retired pilot in England who had a small lesion in his brain, and he will forget which way it goes. If you say hi to him, he'll see your lips move and then hear you, or maybe he'll hear you first and then see the lips move. But an observable gap. It's like 250 milliseconds difference, which is roughly halfway. It's like halfway, in a major league pitcher when they pitch, it's sort of like halfway across, halfway down to halfway to home plate. So it's completely conscious and observable. Yeah. And so and then it turns out that, he's sort of an outlier, but not really, because any two people, it seems, have statistically significant differences in what things they bind together as simultaneous.
Mm.
So you and I in this room, if we could label all the events and if they're happening fast enough,
You and I would differ.
we would differ on a whole bunch of things. So if I said, Brian, what's simultaneous with that snap, and you
Right.
had to write that list down, and then I did it, we would have different lists.
Right. And some people are more accurate in terms of absolute global time, I'm sure, than
Yeah.
others. Right.
And
it's
then,
like musical ability. Like I have no musical ability or language ability or something.
Yeah.
We probably all have different abilities. Yeah.
and actually, music is particularly interesting with this, because you'll habituate your, so if you are playing the organ at King's College, Cambridge,
Mm-hmm.
The lag between you pressing the button and the actual noise is huge, but you will gradually erase that lag and it will seem simultaneous to you.
Ah, okay.
And so there's all that kind of thing going on, and yet we don't notice any of it,
Right.
because when I do the snap, the noise is actually made when my finger hits here.
Yeah.
But there are people who are sound firsters and light firsters,
Yeah.
depending on
Others that are touch. Yeah.
and so some of them might hear the noise when it's there,
Yeah.
others when it's been sitting there for a while. But it's simply crazy to think that it wasn't this snap that caused you to hear that noise.
Right.
And so you don't have disagreement. And so this wild, massive, hidden disagreement, but massive agreement about what things happen now. But if we change the speed, the relative velocities of things that we were, had to deal with, and all of this stuff. If you had like time dilation in your face,
Mm-hmm.
where you were meeting people
relativistically, right.
then would we have come up with this kind of flowing now picture?
Mm.
And then I started to actually also think about animals and stuff.
Mhm.
So seals, they spend so much time underwater. Speed of sound is so different
Right.
underwater than above. How do they sync
Mhm.
their audio and visual? Giraffes, when they're moving, their hoof, that nerve, the signals up the nerves are pretty slow. I forget the speed, but they're not super fast.
Mhm.
They go all the way up to the head,
Right.
all the way back.
19
Yeah,
feet.
19 feet
around
times
turns,
2,
right.
18 feet. It's in the book I joke about, the giraffe maybe has not only a long neck, but a long now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Well, the last couple of minutes before at least I have to go and take the time to go pick up kids, carpool. There's this notion that I hear a lot about, and I can't tell if it's ultimately trivial or if there's something really rich that's just being lost in my obtuse self. And that's this notion of a block universe. What is that? What is it relevant? Is it just a convenient way of thinking about it as kind of a God's perspective, if such a thing could be conceived of? So yeah, what is this block universe that people? It seems to be in vogue now, to the extent that such a thing can be.
Yeah.
vogue.
So in philosophy, they think of there's roughly two types of theory. This kind of tense theory, where you've got this kind of moving now.
And tense, not physically tense, but
That's right.
past tense, present tense, future
Right.
tense. Yeah. Mhm.
And then if you remove all the tense, then what you've got is a block. So you can think of it this way: like if you come across, you're wandering around on campus lost, you see one of these maps, and so the block universe is like the map. The tense theory is like the map with the red dot,
Mm.
that says you are here
Yeah,
now.
right.
Yeah, and so that's the spatial version of this. And so a lot of people say physics is implies the block universe, because there's no red dot.
Mm-hmm.
Physics doesn't give you a red dot.
Right.
And then somebody like me then thinks, well, the red dot is sort of formed by all the relationships there. There's not really an extra thing in the world that's the red dot. It's
Right.
just your consciousness is at that location, and then it seems like, because it seems like you're the be all and end all, you think that's special, but there's nothing really special. That said, so there's this debate between the blockers and the non-blockers. I actually have a kind of minority view in philosophy, whereas I think the two views are the same. So I think they're redescriptions of the same thing, unless you deliberately make them different. So that is, when I say, so the block universe will, the blocker will say, dinosaurs, they exist. They just exist, just like things exist just spatially distant from you, but you can't see them. The things that exist temporally distant from you, they exist. They're all there on the block. The dinosaurs are there. But it's early. But that there is earlier than the moment of utterance when we're speaking right now. Now the tensor, they think, well, no, the only thing that exists is the present. But now they've got a problem because there used to be those dinosaurs, and so then they have to say something about those dinosaurs, because those dinosaurs they're not just like a fiction like Alice in Wonderland or something. That they used to be here,
right?
And so now they have to say something. Whenever they say that thing, you can then translate that into the block that it exists.
I see what you're saying.
And so I think you can translate back and forth without loss.
Oh,
does that mean they're the same theory? Who knows? It's hard to say when it's two representations of the same thing versus two different representations. But if the two representations don't do any work, either of them do any work that the other one doesn't, then it inclines me to think that they're really the same.
Right.
And so to me, I think it's this huge fuss for 100 years since McTaggart, this famous philosopher in 1908, wrote this paper, been this huge fuss fighting over this. And I think it's all
much ado about
nothing.
It's more than
also
because in your philosophy.
Yeah, because I think if you had that tensed view, it doesn't actually explain your experience in any way.
Right.
And so if it doesn't do any explanatory work, then I don't really see, but they often say it does, but it doesn't. And so if it doesn't, then I don't see why I want to bother fighting about it.
Teleological purpose to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that cleared up something for me, and just want to remark how much I'm looking forward to taking your class either in person or remotely on pseudoscience. I can surely provide you with many examples of how I practice pseudoscience quite frequently. After I buy my lottery ticket and get my palm read and get my horoscope read, I will have plenty of fodder for you, Craig Callender, Director of the Center for Practical Ethics here at UC San Diego, a treasured colleague. And I think, though not the first UCSD professor on this, first philosopher on the podcast. So I want to commend you for that. Yes. And I have some parting gifts for you, including finger puppets and space dust. So, Greg, thank you so much. I hope we can do a part 2 someday in the future, if such a thing could be said to exist.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.